Hello, I'm Jenya Delima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole person approach to everything related to both writing and editing. As authors, we might often think of our audience and their needs and expectations for an individual piece of work. But can our storytelling play an even larger role? And how can we use our writing to bridge division and strengthen community? Here to share the link between the author and responsible citizenship is Chip Webster. Well, first, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Mhm. So, first, what would you say is a responsible citizen? And is that an answer that's going to differ from person to person?
Well, I would encourage each person to write their own list because I think that's something that we should think about before we vote and before we act in our democracy. A responsible citizen is somebody who puts nation ahead of party, is someone who votes, who takes the time to do a little homework, not just listen to one network or another and then vote the way they tell you like a robot. Somebody who understands that it's our mutual responsibility to have law and order and to help each other to stay free from crime, and somebody who gets involved and volunteers in the community. I think that's a very important part. We've become so isolated and stuck in our echo chambers that we really have begun to dehumanize people who don't agree with us. And that's the beginning of a very bad spiral down in the society. All organizations, all relationships are based on trust. And the only way you can create trust is by working together. You can't do it online. You can't do it in theory. You can only do it by working together. And a natural part of being human is working on something bigger than yourself.
So, speaking of trust, how do you build trust with your reader or with your potential reader audience?
Wow, that is a question I've never thought of. I think just by being honest
Mm-hmm.
and accessible and being vulnerable.
Yeah. Is that
I think
something that you brought about in your own writing when you were putting together Unity and Service?
Boy, I didn't write it with that spirit in my heart, but I wrote it in the spirit of we have a wonderful democracy that is imperfect. Recognizing the imperfections, I think, is if you look at some of the poems in the book,
Hmm.
uh, I talk about, we can't undo the past. So it's saying, okay, I screwed up in the past. Our society, our country, we have blemishes on our history, but our job is to learn from it and then go forward. So I think being vulnerable and willing to say, I'm imperfect, the process is imperfect, but let's figure out how we can make it better. That to me builds credibility.
And then, what unique opportunities do you think are available to writers to talk about these types of topics that might not be available in another medium or even just in a one on one conversation?
Well, two things. One, just by writing the book and having some distribution of it, people are going to be able to read it who've never met you and can hear your thoughts, solutions. I'm doing a book launch in a couple weeks. I invited some people who don't all agree with me, which is fine. They're friends, and it's a chance to create a platform for a conversation of
Mm.
what do we need to do together to make this a safer and better community and country.
And do you think there's any responsibility to maintaining a certain platform or how the author represents themselves when they are talking about topics like unity and bringing people together?
I think it's important to be honest, and I think what the whole idea of unity and service is to break down barriers. So if your theme is break down barriers, then you should be talking about how you break down barriers and don't villainize people who think differently than you. So, there's some books that are very caustic about people, I mean, it's like,
Yes.
these people are awful. That's not about unity. That's about disunity. So in the theme of unity, it's, how do we come together? How do we work together to make it better for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren. We have a legacy, and I hope in 40 years or 50 years after I'm gone, they look back on the baby boomer generation of saying, they left it better than they found it. So yeah, I think that's the big thing is having that sincere desire. It's like in a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It, I'm sure you've experienced this. I can't hear what you're saying for what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
We see people doing things that are totally diametrically opposed to what they're saying. I mean, that happens a lot in Washington, and that's one of the reasons why there's such a low level of trust. But you build trust by breaking down the barriers, and in writing, I think just by being honest and giving thoughts that stimulate somebody and then also gives them a chance to a call to action.
Well, switching gears a little bit because you talked about barriers, and before we started recording, you talked about some of your barriers to writing. So I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that.
Well, as I mentioned, I got D's in English and they were gifts. And I would have never gotten out of college if I didn't date English majors who helped me take my chicken scratches and turn them into legible papers.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this ongoing belief that I couldn't write. And I went to a big convention, and a friend of mine, we would play basketball at lunch. And just before lunch, there was on the agenda, Irish poet, David White. You may have heard of David White. He's a great poet. And I said, Larry, we can go play 2 hours of basketball and we don't have to listen to an Irish poet. So he dragged me kicking and screaming into the room. And we sat back in the back of the room so we could leave if we didn't like it.
Right.
And David mesmerized 300 crusty old business people with his
Wow.
poetry, with his story. It just blew me away. And then I went and hiked for 2 weeks in Italy with him, hiked in Ireland with him, went to his classes in Whidbey Island, and began to believe that I could write and that I had something to do. And I really went back and looked at a lot of my chicken scratches, and they were actually poems.
Oh.
So, so I wrote my first book, a book of mostly poetry with some autobiographical and philosophical musings.
Mm-hmm.
It's called The Passion for Life, Reflections from the Journey. And then I did a book with an artist who he would do a piece of art and I would do a poem. I'd do a poem, he'd do a piece of art. Terry Brett. And we published that, Paint Poetry and Ekphrastic Journey. But that couldn't have been done. All that creative was juices were there.
Mm-hmm.
But then I happened to meet my current wife, she's a cardiologist. She's very bright and helped me put together the first book. And I would write and then she would help me edit it, what you do. And I think the big message of my story is you have it in you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let what you can't do get in the way of what you can do. I had actually gone through a Johnson O'Connor Foundation, just aptitudes, really in-depth aptitudes. And I took it in my mid 40s. And it turned out that my vocabulary was subpar, but on idophoria, which is creativity, I was in the upper 99%,
Oh,
98%.
very nice.
So I was letting my creative arts, my fear and inability to spell and punctuate get in the way of getting my ideas out.
Mm-hmm.
So it was that, and I got to know Peter Meinke, who's the poet laureate of Florida, and Helen Wallace, who's the poet laureate of St. Pete, and they encouraged me and introduced me to Heather Sellers, who's a professor in writing. I guess I was willing to go out and say, "Can you help me?" So I think asking for help
Mm-hmm.
was a big part of it.
Which is part
And
of community too.
yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, I just feel blessed to have met these people and have them help me get 3 books off the press.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think all of us have that soul in us and how we express it and having it expressed is very important. And writing is a wonderful medium to do that. And that's why I wrote Unity and Service, because I wanted to create something that's very easy to read.
Mhm.
That's why I did just short essays.
Okay.
All my poetry and all my writings, I try to be very succinct, very short, to the point. You know, a lot of books you read and you have to kind of, well, what do they mean by this? What do they mean by that? And the whole idea is to bring it together so it's very accessible. That was the big driver of the essays.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that and why you chose that format. And then how did you divide up the organization of the essays or even decide what order that they would be presented in?
Same way I did my first book is I wrote all the essays and then printed them and laid them out on the floor and literally started shifting them this way and this way and this, oh, this leads to that. So, you know, it's having these random thoughts that needed to be put in what I consider to be the right order. And one of the things I wrote about in the book is that some of the poems or some of the quotes, excuse me, were repeated
Mm.
because in that essay stands alone on its own. So I wanted it to be something that somebody could pick up the book, open to an essay, and read it, and then they didn't have to read anything else but get the message
Oh,
from
yeah.
that essay because I wanted to stand on its own.
And then as you were writing, how did you ensure that the information never felt like a lecture?
You know, I just try and keep it simple and you know something that is interactive for them to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a good lecturer, although my kids may refute that, but no, just I think the brevity keeps it from being a lecture too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. And then what would you say was the easiest part about writing these essays and what was the hardest?
Great question. You know, I'm so passionate about the subject that I can't say that it was the easiest part was writing the concept.
Mm,
The hardest part was editing it, and which, you know, Deb helped me tremendously, but then we would debate back and forth. No, I think this is what I'm trying to say. And if we say it this way, then that doesn't, you know, so
right.
yeah, getting it so that the message is very clear and simple. But yeah, that's the hardest part for me. And then, of course, spelling and punctuation, I just turn it over to people like you.
What else do you think that the editing process added to the manuscript overall?
When
Were
we
there
went
any
to,
substantial
yeah,
changes, for instance?
so Deb and I, you know, edit. And as you know, it's write, edit, write, edit. And you and I have looked at books that they wrote and maybe edited once and they needed a couple more edits.
Mhm.
Editing is so important for the clarity. I mean, what you do and the art that to me, yours is an art form too,
Well, thank you.
um, is so important. So, yeah, there were a couple times where they came back and said, you know, this doesn't quite make sense in this order.
Mm,
You know, would you consider this? I think there was a chapter title that they said, you know, you might want to consider a different title to the essay.
mm-hmm.
I coached CEOs for years, and I use the metaphor of golf. Nobody can see their backswing.
Ah, yes.
And what you do is you see our backswing. You say, you know, if you just shift a little bit to the left and used this word versus that word, it's going to change the meaning to what you're trying to accomplish. And
Mhm.
that's why it's important to dialogue, pardon me, with the editor. It's not just here, give it and then take it, but it's
Right.
a conversation. And then sometimes the editor has one idea and you have an idea, but there's a third idea that you create together that's even better.
Yeah, I agree. See again, community, right?
Yeah, it's a team sport, you know,
Yes.
and I had no idea, you know, starting when I did my first book, what a team sport it is. And I think it makes the product better.
Did you ever find your own perspectives changing as you were writing, or maybe even as you were revising and editing?
Yes. Yeah, it's the words I use. I tend to be, I'm trying to be very center. I'm trying to create a document that both moderate lefts and moderate rights can agree to and work together on. And so my natural inclination is a little bit further to the right, but I understand that if I write from that perspective, I'm going to create barriers, and my heart, my soul is down the middle to help us work together. We can't do this by ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So there are words that I use that probably were more loaded, and with the help of Deb and the editor and me being willing to open it up and look at it differently, I changed wording that would make it more neutral. I didn't want it to be empty and kind of a platitude. I wanted to have meaning, but I wanted it to be something that moderate lefts and moderate rights can relate to. The whole message is let's put the nation ahead of the party and let's break down these barriers, work together to leave it better than we found it.
Mm-hmm. And then how important do you think it was to communicate your goals for the book to the rest of the people on your team so they could also help you reach that vision?
Critical. And we have to have a mission. We have to have the big picture. And everybody has to have a chance to contribute to that.
Mm-hmm.
I can come up with here's the framework I see, but Deb, helped me a lot with making it more palatable. And the editor, she did help us, made it even better, even stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And then Polly Letevsky, who My Word Publishing, who she was very helpful finding people who would help us do the cover, who would help us with the layout and the editing and the art. It was all very much a team effort. When you walk into a book and you don't know what you're doing about writing, you think, oh, George wrote this book. Well, if George is smart, there's 20 other people that helped George write it
Mm-hmm.
and edit it and make it better.
Well, what advice would you give to other authors who want to write something that will inspire, motivate, and also thoughtfully educate their readers?
Do it now. Start writing. Start writing, and lay it out and write it again and again until it gets to where you are and have the courage to put it out there. Most difficult thing I've done in my life was to, okay, let's print the book. And I'm afraid it's going to look stupid. And
Mm,
I'm afraid to look stupid. But I also knew that the message I have is an important message. And if it blesses somebody else, that's all that matters. And so if you're a writer wrestling with, do I write this? Just write it. Just do it. Yeah, the road to success is always under construction. So there's always going to be a reason not to do it,
true.
but stop it. If you have a message, do it.
What pushed you from just thinking about the idea to actually executing the idea?
Well, unity and service, I've been thinking about for 20 some odd years. And in reading the research of how trust is degenerated, in the 70s, just as an example, like 80% of the people trusted banks were going to do the right thing.
Mm,
Now it's in the 30s. 80% of the people thought doctors and hospitals would do the right thing. Now it's in the high 20s, low 30s. And so this whole trend of this country becoming separate and becoming untrusting, to me, it was a passion. Somebody gave a speech and they said, if you have a song, sing it. If you have a bell, ring it. And I would say, if you have a pen, write it.
Well, before we end, do you have any closing thoughts or anything new and exciting coming up that you can share with our listeners?
I'm beginning to think about another book, and it would be more of how, as a nation, we can communicate and relate to each other. We're such a pivotal point. So that's sort of out there, but keep writing. And I did do a poem. Do you mind hearing a poem?
No, go ahead.
So this is a poem I've edited and edited and edited more than any other pieces of poetry. It's called Microvalidations. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. English proverb. Microclimates, microbiomes, microaggressions. We live in a microclimate. Microbiomes live in us. Microaggressions are part of life. What we need more of are microvalidations, more microaffirmations. We've become trapped in our silos. We've become contemptuous of those who don't agree with us. They must not be human. Our country, our cities, our friends have become divided. We can't keep distancing ourselves from each other. We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we'll all hang separately. Benjamin Franklin. Our children, our grandchildren need us to hang together for their future. A healthy democracy requires citizens to work together to remain free. We need to see our interdependence and break down the barriers that divide us. We need each other. Start with micro-validations. Open the door for someone. Say hello. Talk to your neighbors. Look people in the eye and acknowledge that they exist. Reconnect with each other. Affirm everyone's humanness.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I didn't expect a poem, but it's a lovely closing note.
Thank you.
And thank you again for being here, too.
You bet.
And thank you for listening. And be sure to check out the show notes for additional information, including all of Chip's links. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I'd appreciate if you could rate or review this podcast on Spotify or Apple. Thanks again.